In today's video, we will be reviewing Sigma's latest APS-C prime lens, the 23mm F1.4 that's available for Sony, Fujifilm, and Nikon. 23mm on APS-C gives you the very popular and personally my favorite 35mm in full frame field of view. Sigma did not send this lens. I bought this with my own personal money, and over the last 2 months of ownership, it has been glued to my Sony a6700. It was my favorite lens with my time in Japan, so in today's video, I'm going to give you a real-world ownership review of the Sigma 23mm f1.4 DC-DN. So let's just jump right into it.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, I love that. And then look this way, Ellie. Yeah. I might get one just like hands in front, or maybe hand in pocket. Yeah, I love that.
For a bit of context, I've actually owned all of Sigma's DC-DN APS-C prime lenses, and I think they are just fantastic lenses. But I was definitely a little bit shocked when I initially bought this Sigma 23mm because it's much more expensive than the previous DC-DN lenses from Sigma. This lens was released earlier in 2023, and to justify the raise in price, Sigma actually released the following statement. This lens has been designed to achieve the highest level of optical performance in the history of the Sigma DC-DN line. End quote. So does this price rise warrant better quality when the original DC-DN lenses were already fantastic? This lens is fantastic for portraits, for landscapes, and also street photography. And when shooting wide open, this lens is fantastically sharp in the middle of the image. And that's kind of expected, as every single Sigma lens that I've personally owned and also tested on this YouTube channel have been extremely sharp. And the main reason I buy and use Sigma lenses for my professional work is not only just the sharpness and the autofocus, but they have this really clean, contrasty pop. This Sigma 23mm f1.4 also has a very close focus distance, and at close focus distances, the sharpness is absolutely stunning. There is a little bit of softness wide open at f1.4 in the corners that typically goes away above f2.8, and the reason for this is the distortion and also the vignette that you get from this lens. And this is due to the smaller element that you'll find on these Sigma APS-C lenses. You also get a very slight amount of chromatic aberration wide open at f1.4. You'll only really notice this on these test examples, and in the real world you're not going to notice this chromatic aberration. The distortion, vignette, and also chromatic aberration gets fixed with in-camera corrections. If you don't turn them on your camera, you can also just turn them on in Lightroom. While we're on the topic of Adobe Lightroom, if you like the way that I've edited any of these photos, I have just brought out a new V2 preset pack, which is linked in the description down below. So if you want to replicate my editing styles and the colors and contrast of my photos, make sure you check out those V2 presets, which are linked down below. This lens has fantastic autofocus, especially paired with the new Sony a6700 that has that new AI autofocus. During my time in Japan, I never missed any shots because of autofocus when shooting on this lens. The autofocus for video is also fantastic, but this lens is definitely a photography first lens because this 23mm from Sigma actually has some really bad focus breathing. Focus breathing is something that I don't really notice on a lens unless it's really apparent. Moving on to the build quality of this lens, it's basically the exact same as the 30mm in terms of build. But when comparing it to other third-party lenses like what Viltrox have been doing, You don't have any switches or aperture dials. Also, if you pick up a few of these lenses, you'll quickly notice that all of the filter threads are completely different sizes. When you compare this to Viltrox's 23mm, their 33mm, and their 56mm, they all have the same filter size as 52mm. And moving forward, I really hope companies like Sigma really follow suit with what Viltrox are doing in terms of their build design, as having aperture dials and switches and also having the same front filters would be fantastic. There's also no USB-C connection on the Sigma 23mm, so if you have to do a firmware update, you have to go out and buy the Sigma docking station to do that firmware update, while companies like Viltrox have USB-C connections on the lens. I also think that this lens isn't the most attractive lens, and that's probably why it's not that popular on the Fuji system, as companies like Viltrox and Fuji's lenses are just much more aesthetically pleasing to look at. Now, from the statement that I read earlier from Sigma, there has been one improvement that I have noticed on this new 23mm, and that's a reduction in flares from bright lights or the sun. These older DC DN lenses are still fantastic, I highly recommend them, but they do tend to flare a lot, even when you're using the hood that is applied. This 23mm, they've definitely done something to the coatings to resist the flares more. But other than that, I haven't noticed any massive improvements. And in conclusion, I think this lens is fantastic and I have no complaints on image quality and autofocus. And if you are a Sony user looking for a 23mm APS-C lens, you only really have one option, and that is the Viltrox 23mm F1.4. I personally have not owned or used the 23mm from Viltrox, but it is a lot cheaper. But I can't really comment on the optical quality and also the autofocus until I have tested that lens. You can also attach 24mm full frame lenses that I have also personally done with this Samyang 24mm f1.8, and the only reason why I don't use this Samyang lens on my A6700 is because it doesn't work with the autofocus. This lens needs a firmware update and there's no USB-C port to update firmware. But I do think the Sigma 23mm is the best option if you want a 35mm f1.4 for Sony APS-C. And while I was in Japan, I mainly just used the 16mm, this 23mm, and the 56mm, all from Sigma, and that was a fantastic focal range, giving me a 24, a 35, and an 85mm. If you want to see more images that are shot with that combination in Japan, I just released a video giving my final thoughts on the Sony A6700, which is kind of like a vlog, so if you want to see that video, go check that out right now. Otherwise, make sure you like this video, subscribe for more content, check out my presets, and we'll see you next week.